the philosophy of Renaissance. And first of all, I'm going to explain you the meaning of the term Renaissance. There are two senses in which this term is used in scientific literature. So there's a wider sense and a narrow sense. And in a wider sense, Renaissance concerns European history from the early 14th to the early 17th century. And this chronological term is closely related to the development of culture and art. And there's also a narrow sense of the term Renaissance. This term was explicated by the Swiss art historian Jacob Burckhardt, and he used this term in order to refer to the revival of art and classical learning initiated in Italian culture. You know, the Renaissance is called the source of modern scientific and technological civilization. The development of philosophical as well as scientific rationalism of the 17th century, as well as the period of the so-called Enlightenment of the 18th century, they are associated with the heritage of the Renaissance. And you know, in studies of the history of culture and thought, there is a dual image of the culture of the Renaissance. On the one hand, there is a bright and radiant, easily recognizable image of the Renaissance culture, and the culture of Renaissance offers a really great promise, the promise of restoration and innovation of human life. So the main trends in the Renaissance culture are that of the restoration of antiquity, the establishment of the intrinsic value of human personality, exaltation of human dignity. And you know, as such, this image is qualified as world historical image of Renaissance. On the other hand, some traditionally oriented scholars identify some negative features of Renaissance culture. From their point of view, the Renaissance is seen as a period of total secularization and a relativization of the fundamental semantic and value orientations. It is also seen as a period of atomization and individualistic dispersal of the organic unity of traditional human communities, as if the principle of the universal human destiny is violated. And it is due to this trend that the unity of human destiny and community is built purely mechanically. So, the period of Renaissance traditionally is called the Age of Adventure, because mainly this period is represented by voyages of exploration and the discovery of some new lands. Another really essential feature of this Renaissance era, the religious reformation initiated by Martin Luther and John Calvin. Yet, we know that Renaissance is also admired because of the huge progress of science and technology. And this progress represented by the Copernican heliocentric theory. And the developments in technology and science indirectly provided some material for philosophical reflection and consideration. You know, the thinkers of the Renaissance, they envisaged the prospect of acquiring some new meanings and values, the prospect of creating some new image of the world. You know, the world is seen as subjected to the prospect of transformation through art, science, and technology. And philosophy approached both science and religion, magic and mysticism, forming just a kind of unique symbiosis. That is the intrinsic feature of the Renaissance philosophy. You know, antiquity, Christianity, magic, mystical motives, and the beginnings of some new European rationalism and technicism intertwined in the Renaissance worldview, in the Renaissance philosophy. Anyway, the period of Renaissance was notable for its achievement in classical learning, the arts, literature. These were the products of so-called humanism. And Renaissance humanism was a cultural movement centered on rhetoric, literature, and history, so-called liberal arts. And the Renaissance scholars and thinkers coined the term studia humanitatis. Renaissance humanists understood by studia humanitatis a cycle of 5 subjects: grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. And these subjects were mainly based on ancient classical literature, the Greek and Latin classics. So, in a narrow sense, a humanist was an expert in the studia humanitatis. And so, the horizon of the Renaissance worldview is outlined by the idea of humanitatis, or studia humanitatis, because through this idea, the intention is realized to finally determine the true essence and proper purpose of a human being, the purpose of human life, the purpose and value of human creative activity, and the place of human in the order of the universe and the global arrangement of the universe. So, you know, the highest goal of knowledge is just to reconstruct an ideal image of a human being, and thanks to poetry and art understood in a broad sense, thanks to constantly refined knowledge, a person creates an ideal image of his or her own future destiny, and the person is simply fascinated by his own ideal perspective, self-fulfillment. So, humanists sought to make philosophy more literary in presentation and realization of the major and intrinsic interests that should guide human creative initiatives and projects. Humanists recovered and translated into Latin a large reservoir of Greek classical texts unknown or ignored in the Middle Ages, and the humanists contributed to the revival of the ideas of Platonism, Stoicism, and skepticism as well. Epicureanism was also very popular, just as the ethical framework which was opposed to the medieval asceticism. This humanist movement was stimulated by the discovery of large amounts of previously unknown literature from ancient Greece and Rome. We know that in the period of scholasticism, Aristotelianism was very influential and popular, but people read lots of works of Aristotle, and they used some logical tools developed by Aristotle in order to elaborate scholastic problems. Yet Aristotelianism was treated a little bit critically by the humanists, because Aristotelianism was perceived as the methodological core of the old-fashioned scholastic thinking. Platonism underwent a resurgence, especially in the Florentine school directed by Marsilio Ficina, who translated lots of works of Plato, lots of dialogues of Plato, and Plato's complete works were translated into Latin for the first time in the Florentine school, that formed the ground for the further development of philosophical doctrines that tried to combine some new ideas with the ideas of classical authors. Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism also exerted great influence on the doctrines of humanists. The revival of different schools of ancient philosophy created just a really great variety of trends of thought, and humanists tried to explore these alternative directions, but mainly they oscillated around the idea of the intrinsic value and fundamental dignity of every human person. So the major Renaissance thinkers include Nicholas of Cusa. He stands in between old scholastic tradition and new Renaissance thought, and was greatly influenced by some Neoplatonic ideas. Also, of course, Marsilio Ficino, Giordano Bruno, Pico della Mirandola, Lorenzo Valla, Erasmus, Leon Battista Alberti, Thomas More, Tommaso Campanella, and Niccolo Machiavelli as well. Take, for instance, Francis Petrarch. Francis Petrarch expressed preference for Plato, and he sincerely sought to reconcile Christ with Cicero, believing that secular education, knowledge of ancient poetry and philosophy cannot contradict the principles of faith, for it serves the moral improvement of every human. And without breaking with the principles of the Christian worldview, Petrarch, however, looked for other ways to know the truth, to comprehend the meaning of human life. And, these internal struggles and doubts found a vivid expression in his Confession or in his work My Secret, and numerous letters, treatises, and poetry. So in the Confession, two scales of values are compared. Christian ascetic morality designed to cleanse the soul from sinfulness and lead it to eternal bliss, and the philosopher person's earthly life, creativity, poetry, glory, love, enjoyment of the beauty of the real world. And Petrarch doesn't give preference to any one of these moral and value systems, but he tries to reconcile the contradictions existing between them, and he's convinced that the path to heaven and bliss doesn't require the rejection of everything worldly, everything which is associated with creativity and pleasure of life. So you see, Petrarch laid the foundations of a new humanistic ethics. Its main principle is the achievement of a moral ideal through self-knowledge, active virtue, education. Another humanist, Leonardo Bruni, he considered himself an Aristotle, but his translation of some of Plato's dialogues inaugurated the Renaissance reception of Plato. And this process, the process of translating classical Plato's dialogues into Latin, culminated in the great Renaissance Platonist figure of Marsilio Ficino. Marsilio Ficino combined competence in Greek and humanist literary interests with the profession of a philosopher. And only such a combination allowed Ficino to make Platonism a powerful element in Renaissance philosophy. Marsilio Ficino, in his work Plato's Theology, develops the image of man as the center of the universe, as the bonds of the world, copula mundi. So man turns out to be the central link in the endless chain of being, since he's the very center in which all the different and opposites that exist in the world converge. Therefore, in him the heavenly descends to the earthly, and the earthly ascends to the heavenly. And since a person doesn't have a once and for all completed appearance, or a pre-established and unchanging image, to the extent that he can be everything and everywhere among things, he can acquire any quality of existence. And this idea was developed by another very influential humanist, Pico della Mirandola. Pico della Mirandola introduced classical skepticism into Renaissance philosophical discourse, and Pico's work, An Examination of the Emptiness of Pagan Learning, incorporated large tracts of that still untranslated works of Sextus Empiricus. According to Pico della Mirandola, the condition of human existence is to have no conditions, to be truly quis who and not quid what. That is the anticipation of existentialism. To be the cause of free action. Man is everything because he can be everything. An animal, a plant, a stone, but also an angel or a son of God. Man as the image and likeness of God lies in this, in the fact that he is the cause of his own actions and choices. And it is according to Pico della Mirandola that human being isn't determined by any pre-established eidos, any pre-established image or icon, as if existence is prior to essence, and human being is capable of transforming his or her own life to ascend to the highest steps in the hierarchy of the universe, or to degrade, to degenerate into some beast-like creatures. So these ways are open to humans, and we are what we make of ours. We have unrestricted creative potential, and through the symbolism of our artworks, we can just extend to infinity, symbolically extend to infinity. The humanists such as Cosimo Raimondi and Lorenzo Valla were the chief proponents of Epicureanism in the 15th century. Lorenzo Valla was an Italian humanist who promoted rhetoric, grammar, and philology at the expense of scholastic logic and metaphysics, and Valla reduced logic to a tool of rhetoric and held that most metaphysical terminology was nothing more than ungrammatical jargon, which should be replaced by a philosophical discourse based on the accepted usage of the base ancient Latin. So you see, the humanists, they challenged medieval Aristotelianism. They offered some new translations of Aristotle that in some respects amounted to some fresh interpretations, and they also significantly enriched the Aristotelian corpus by translating the Poetics and the late ancient Greek commentators on Aristotle. Yet Platonism was of really great importance, and Platonism was really influential in Renaissance thought. Renaissance humanists, they looked upon the classical past as a model of activity, and they restored man to the center of attention, and they channeled their efforts to the recovery of classical learning, particularly in philosophy, especially in the philosophy of Plato. The revival of different schools of ancient philosophy created different schools in the humanist movement and became the major content of Renaissance philosophy. You know, the philosophy of nature also developed greatly in this period. In fact, there are three major stages in the evolution of philosophical thought of the Renaissance. First one is the so-called humanistic or anthropological trend, opposing medieval theocentrism. The interest focused on man and his relations with the world. Anthropocentric worldview had become paradigmatic one. Then Neoplatonic trend. This trend was associated with the elaboration of ontological problems. The development of synthetic theories of the universe based on the revival and revision of Neoplatonism, pantheistic tendencies, the doctrine of the involvement of God and the world. This is clearly seen in the doctrine of Nicholas of Cusa. And natural philosophical research, philosophy of nature, combining some rational naturalistic doctrines and magical doctrines as well. The study of the great book of nature, just learning how to read the great book of nature. According to the teachers of the Italian humanist and architect Leon Battista Alberti, nature is the best organizer of things. It manifests itself to man in all things, and so only people can know and use the forces of nature. And architecture embodies all human greatness and purpose. And another idea which is really characteristic of how these Renaissance thinkers treated nature, the idea of beauty and sympathy, penetrating into all things by the force of the love current. This idea turned out to be the basis, so to speak, of an undifferentiated aesthetic continuum, in which the medieval vertical hierarchical universe was restructured into a horizontal perspective universe, animated in each of its parts and imbued with the universal principle of the formation and transformation of all things in time. You know, ontological problems in the philosophy of the Renaissance were approached from the standpoint of Platonism, and that was to a certain extent connected with the protest against the spread of Aristotelianism in the era of scholasticism. Plato, in the anti-scholastic philosophy of the Renaissance, becomes a symbol of progress, and his philosophy is considered to be a synthesis of all the philosophy of the past. And Marsilio Ficino, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, they can be distinguished among the prominent Platonists of the 15th century. And in the second half of the 16th and early 17th century, the philosophy of nature began to develop in the philosophy of the Renaissance. And among those who explored the issue are Nicholas of Cusa and Giordano Bruno. So let's turn to, first of all, to the figure of Nicholas of Cusa, because Nicholas of Cusa is a philosopher who stands in between old scholastic tradition of thought and newly born innovative trends that had become prominent in the Renaissance culture and philosophy. Nicholas of Cusa, also called Nicholas Cusanus, he was a German philosopher, and he was greatly influenced by some of the medieval philosophers, such as Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, even Bonaventure, who was the proponent of the mysticism, Meister Eckhart as well. But Nicholas of Cusa was receptive of the major ideas of Neoplatonism. Nicholas' philosophy was also influenced by Plato, Proclus, Pseudo-Dionysius, and John Scotus Erigena. Nicholas of Cusa developed an interesting eclectic system of metaphysics, and so the tenets of this metaphysical doctrine pointed in the direction of the transition between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance culture. Among Nicholas' most significant early works is the Doctor Ignorantia, unlearned ignorance. Nicholas claims that the human mind needs to discover its necessary ignorance of what the divine being is like, an ignorance that results from the infinite ontological and cognitive disproportion between infinity itself, that is God, and the finite human or angelic knower. Nicholas of Cusa contributed to the development of dialectics, and he integrated dialectics into the foundations of metaphysics or ontology. He treated God as maximum. He used this mathematical concept. God as maximum of being, as the absolute maximum of being. And all things coincide in God. God as undifferentiated being is beyond all opposition. That was his idea. All things coincide in God because God is beyond all opposition, beyond all determination, and all differences and opposites are united in their infinite measure, so that what would be logical contradictions for finite things coexist without contradiction in God. So God is maximum of being, and as the absolute maximum of being, God is the measure of all things, and God is identical to them in as much as He is identical with their reality, quiddity, or essence. And in general, the measure of a thing must contain all the possible being of that sort of thing, and so is infinite or unlimited in its being. The world in its finitude is seen as the explication of God, just unveiling here of God, as if all things are complicated in God as the maximum of being. Actually, we can use examples that are accessible to our understanding. Imagine a corporeal entity, an object, the one which is moving with infinite velocity in the universe. At the same moment, it is everywhere and nowhere. So that is a good example of how opposites coincide in infinite perspective. And there are lots of other interesting examples. So Nicholas of Cusa used geometrical examples. So his ontology can be interpreted along two different lines. So according to one line of interpretation, Nicholas regards finite objects as having no respective positive essence of their own. For God himself is the self-identical essence of each finite thing. That is a pantheistic view. So the relative identity of each thing is said to consist only in its difference from all other finite things, and all such differences, they are accidental, and all relations between these things, they are internal relations. The other line of interpretation of Nicholas' ontology is more generally accepted. Some created things are substances, and these do have positive essences of their own, and in accordance with their respective essences, finite things differ essentially from one another. God is the essence of these things, in that He is the essence of the respective essences of these things, even as He is being itself entitas, which sustains in existence whatever is a being ends. That is the influence of Thomas Aquinas, who claimed that essence and existence are identical in God. So this distinction between being and beings, Nicholas draws from Meister Eckhart, a medieval proponent of mysticism. Also, there are several cosmological ideas that were in the center of Nicholas' interest. Nicholas denies that the universe is finite, and he also denies that the universe is infinite. That is another instance of dialectical thinking. The universe is not finite in that it is not physically limited by anything outside its dimensions. On the other hand, it is finite in that it has a definite measure known to God alone. So the universe is finite but unbounded. And Nicholas terms it privately infinite, in contradistinction to God, who is negatively infinite, since he is not even conceivably limited. So this resembles Immanuel Kant's account of the contradictory ideas in our reason, whether the universe is limited or unlimited in space and time. Kant exposed and explored the alternative routes and demonstrated that we can give proof of both of theses, because that's the dialectical nature of our reason, and at the same time this is a clear manifestation of the limits of our understanding when we are concerned with the exploration of such things as the finity or infinity. In fact, Nicholas of Cusa claimed that there is no perfect precision in the world. The universe's circumference is not perfectly spherical, nor is the Earth a perfect sphere. Neither the universe nor the Earth has an exact physical center, and thus the Earth is not the fixed center of the universe. And likewise, the Earth appears to us to be at the center of the universe, and that's how it appears to us. We infer that the fixed stars are at the outer circumference. However, these stars also have inhabitants who judge themselves to be at the center, and the Earth to be on the periphery. So, you see, that is the first insight of just the principle of relativity and the role of the observer is emphasized and should be taken into account when building the picture of the universe. Nicholas of Cusa also contributed to epistemology. In his work, The Vision of God, Nicholas states that there cannot be in the intellect anything which is such that it wasn't first in the senses. So it seems that in that period he rejected the notion of innate ideas. Yet, in another work, The Layman on the Mind, he allows that the mind, through construction, can make concepts of things whose forms are not found in nature. So that is the recognition of the spontaneous constructive activity of human mind. And moreover, the mind has an innate power of judgment by which to weigh the strength of rational considerations, and for which it is familiar a priori with basic moral principles. So this opens the way just to the recognition of the value of a priori knowledge. Although human beings cannot know the exact liquidity of any given thing, they do nevertheless perceive the things themselves through the medium of sensory images and conceptual forms. So Nicholas of Cusa emphasizes sensory and conceptual perspectivity, the role of ratio or reason as the synthesizer of the data, and he also acknowledges the conditioned operations of the intellect, intellectus. So But of course, one must be careful how not to exaggerate his dim prefiguring of Kant. Mathematical knowledge he regards as a priori uncertain because mathematical entities are conceptual entities elicited from a known and precise way by our reason. So, and Nicholas also endorsed the doctrine that these conceptual numbers are images, as it were, of God's thought. Yeah? Once again, I'd like to draw attention to the concept of dogma ignorantia, literally learned ignorance. He used this term in the sense of an insight into the incomprehensibility of the infinite. And this term, learned ignorance, refers to man's knowledge of God, primarily. And this knowledge unavoidably includes a negative element, since God immeasurably surpasses the knowledge of Him gleaned from this phenomenal world. Yet for man, this is truly a real learning. What are the epistemological implications of this doctrine of learned ignorance? Our knowledge is never of reality, the infinite measure of things, that is their essence, but all of finite images of reality corresponding to the finite copies with which we must deal. These images are constructed by our own minds and do not represent an immediate grasp of any reality. Their highest form is found in mathematics. It is only through mathematics the reason can understand the world. That is another idea which is really essential to the worldview of Renaissance thinkers, because through mathematics, through a mathematical algorithm, we can calculate our prospect achievements and developments. So, and we can also reconstruct the picture of the world using the language of symbols, and numbers are among the most significant symbols, because the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, and that later became the central idea of rationalists and scientists. So, Cuso was much read in the Renaissance, and the sometimes said to have had significant influence on German thought of the 18th century, in particular on Leibniz and on German idealism, on Hegel, for instance, and his speculative dialectics, because the idea of the synthesis of the opposites is the central idea of Hegel's speculative dialectics. We should explore the ideas of some other Renaissance thinkers, and among these thinkers, the figure of an Italian Neoplatonic philosopher, Marsilio Ficino, is a really prominent one, because Marsilio Ficino played a leading role in the cultural life of Florence. Ficino was ordinated a priest in 1473, and Ficino hoped to draw people to Christ by means of Platonism. And the works of Plato first became accessible to the Latin-speaking West through Ficino's translation and commentaries. And the impact of Plato's work was considerably affected by Ficino's other interests. Ficino accepted Neoplatonic interpretations of Plato, including the interpretations of Plotinus, whom he translated, and he saw Plato as the hero Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical Egyptian sage. Hermes Trismegistus was supposed to be the author of the Hermetic Corpus, and Ficino translated the Hermetic Corpus early in his career. Ficino embraced the notion of the so-called Prisca Theologia, an ancient wisdom that encapsulated philosophic and religious truth. He claimed that this ancient wisdom was handed on to Plato and was later validated by the Christian revelation. And Ficino believed that the texts going under the names of Hermes Trismegistus and Orpheus, as well as the Chalcidian oracles, were theological writings of extreme antiquity, belonging roughly to the time of Moses. So they represented a tradition of Gentile theology, parallel to the Hebrew Old Testament, that culminated in the writings of Plato. And like the Old Testament, they were inspired by obscure writings whose full meaning only became clear with the advent of Jesus Christ. And the writings of the ancient theologian had prepared the Gentiles for Christianity, as the Old Testament writings had prepared the Jews. You know, this idea wasn't the original one, because it was Clement of Alexandria who introduced this idea that the writings of ancient theologians prepared the Gentiles for the adoption of the truth of Christian revelation. Though, of course, not all of them that managed to adopt the truth of Christian revelation. Nevertheless, some seeds of revelation can be found in the writings of Plato, though Plato and subsequent authors may not be aware of the value of those seeds, ideas, or the blinks of divine truth that they had eventually managed to grasp and articulate in their philosophical writings. So, he claimed that Platonism could be successfully reconciled with Christian faith, and the credibility of the Christian truth be much enhanced among people educated by humanists for whom ancient authority was paramount. Platonism could also act as an introductory credo, preparing the philosophically minded for the higher truths of Christianity, as it had in the case of Origen or Augustine. And it could serve as an apologetic weapon against skeptical intellectuals. And Ficino said as much in a letter praising Pico della Mirandola as a fisher of men for having used Plato as a net to draw Averroists and Epicureans back to Christianity. Ficino developed a rather interesting interpretation of the historical role of Platonism, and this interpretation integrated the greatest of ancient philosophers into the Christian tradition and strengthened the humanist hope that Christendom could renew itself from ancient sources without alienating itself wholly from pagan culture, in which humanists discovered the classical models for the truly human creative activity and life filled with not merely pleasures but with activities that contribute to the enhancement and purification of human nature. The ancient theology also presupposed Ficino's wider belief in natural religion. The religion was natural to all men. He believed that all manifestations of natural religion were in some degree good as expressions of the natural desire of man for God. Ficino was preoccupied with the question of the immortality of the soul, as well as Plato, as you, I guess, should remember. And one of Ficino's principal books was entitled Platonic Theology on the Immortality of the Soul. Ficino held that those who denied personal immortality were undermining the traditional belief in rewards and punishment in the afterlife. They were removing a key sanction against immoral behavior. And in his argument to the 10th book of Plato's Laws, Ficino went so far as to say that the immortality of the soul was the main foundation for religion. Immortality was central to Ficino's work because of his close connection with contemplative experience. You know, for Ficino, experience of God may be attained in contemplation. This contemplation constitutes the highest human act of consciousness, and it therefore both defines the essence of humanity and establishes the end of human existence, the value of human life. So both the contemplative experience of God in this life is only partial and transitory. The soul must be capable of some form of separate, incorporeal existence in which its natural appetite for the knowledge and enjoyment of God may be fulfilled. And this is at best an argument for the soul's survival after death, and not necessarily an argument for eternal existence, since Ficino admits elsewhere that souls are created in time. So Ficino also employs the argument from self-motion found in Plato's dialogue Phaedrus. All things, they are alive, and it is psyche or soul which is the source of life and the source of energy, and the soul itself acts as a mover for the bodies. But insofar the soul itself is a mover, it itself should be capable of moving itself. And the thing which is capable of moving itself, which doesn't depend on its motion and all energies and activities on any other entity, which is ontologically distinct from it, should exist eternally, should have this self-sustained existence. Therefore, the soul, which gives energy and life to corporeal entities and is capable of moving itself, should be immortal. Immortal. That was Plato's argument from self-motion in favor of immortality of our soul. The immortal soul is also central to Ficino's philosophy in a broader metaphysical context. The early books of the Theologia Platonica lay out an ontological hierarchy of 5 substances: God, angel, soul, quality, matter. No, this hierarchy was probably taken from Proclus, a Neoplatonic writer, though the hypostasis of quality seems to be original with Ficino. And within the hierarchy, soul functions as the central link. What is above soul is eternal, immaterial, unchanging, intelligible. What is below it is temporal, material, mutable, and sensible. It is the soul that binds the two spheres together and makes them a unity. So the unifying functions of soul mean that the soul is radically divided within itself. It contains within itself 2 separate and opposing impulses. The soul has a natural desire for God, which drives it to cut itself off from the body and empirical reality, just to turn within the upwards to the source of its being through rational activity. In addition, Ficino posits another trend which leads the soul to care for lower things, such as the body, for which it has a natural affection. And to these 2 natural tendencies or affections, they correspond the higher parts of the soul, preeminently the reasoning and noetic powers, and the lower parts of the soul, such as sensation, vegetation, which are responsible for its empirical activity. To a certain extent, we see this doctrine combines the doctrine of Plato with that of Aristotle. And Plato's doctrine of the preexistence and transmigration of souls presented Ficino with a major interpretive interpretive challenge, since it threatened the Florentine's larger project of demonstrating the compatibility of Platonism and Christianity. The doctrine had been confidently attributed to Plato by Plotinus. Several of Ficino's contemporary opponents, such as the Dominicans of Narola and Dominic of Flanders, used this doctrine to discredit Ficino's Platonic revival. And the doctrine itself was condemned by the Inquisition in articles published in the University of Pisa in 1490. So, the doctrine of the pre-existence and transmigration of souls, which was actually originally introduced by Pythagoreans and then developed by Plato and reinterpreted by Marsilio Ficino. It seems to be incompatible with the idea of personal immortality. The most popular of Ficino's original works was 3 books on life. The work contains the fullest Renaissance exposition of a theory of magic based mainly on Neoplatonic sources. Ficino postulated a living cosmos in which the world soul is linked to the world body by spirit. And this relationship is mirrored in man. Human spirit or astral body links his body and soul, and the resulting correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm allows both the man's control of natural objects through magic and his ascent to knowledge of God. Other popular works were his commentary on Plato's Symposium, which presents a theory of Platonic love. So Ficino's most influential work was his commentary on Symposium, known as De Amore, on love. The De Amore was written in the form of a literary dialogue, set in the villa of Lorenzo de' Medici, Ficino's friends and patrons as the interlocutors. On love was translated into Italian, French, and German, and this work popularized the concept of Platonic love, a concept that became a popular poetical conceit in the later Renaissance. And now Ficino is usually credited as the inventor of the concept of Platonic love, and the expression amor platonicus actually occurs in one of his letters. Ficino's account of love, however, is closely based on Neoplatonic thinker Plotinus. The concept combines Platonian reading of love with the will of St. Augustine, the charity of St. Paul, and ideas of friendship found in Aristotle, the Stoics, and Cicero's Laelius. So Ficino interprets our experience of love in terms of the spiritual dynamics of the Neoplatonic cosmos. A true experience of love awakens one to the natural desire of the soul for union with God. And such an awakening may begin with a sensual element, but that is a mere preparation for genuine love, which is the love of God. And the insensations of beauty or goodness that kindle mutual desire between human beings are to be understood as reflections of the divine beauty and goodness. What we love in others rightly belongs to God. To give love to another without at the same time giving love to God is nothing but robbery. Yet the true basis of active love is a conscious striving of souls together towards God in contemplative experience. It is the active search for truth in the philosophical life which is the true basis of love and forms a genuine union between lovers. So real divine love is thus independent of any sexual relations of the lovers that can exist between members of the same or opposite genders. And Ficino's concept of love, as I told you, subsumes the St. Paul's and Augustine concept of charity. It also absorbs the classical pagan concept of friendship. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, for example, argues that true friendship is necessarily between equals, and it has as its subject common pursuits, and Ficino understood this to mean that souls united in contemplation of the same object are eo ipso equal. Such souls are always present to each other even when separated. And love even has the power to transform the lover into the image of the beloved. And mutual love, which constitutes a concrete communion between persons, is the only true and perfect form of love. It is not only a moral obligation, but a cosmic necessity. Now let's turn to another figure in the history of Renaissance thought. I guess that you are acquainted with this figure, Giordano Bruno. He was an Italian Renaissance philosopher born at Nola, and he was also influenced by ancient Hermetic writings. Hermetic corpus was a body of writings attributed to the mythical Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus. And you know, Bruno called for a return to the magical religion of the Egyptians. Bruno was also strongly influenced by Nicholas of Cusa and Marsilio Ficino. And Bruno believed that one could so imprint images of the universe on the mind as to achieve special knowledge of divine realities and the magic powers associated with such knowledge. And Bruno emphasized the importance of the imagination as a cognitive power, since it brings us in contact with the divine. And he also held that human ideas are mere shadows of divine ideas. That's the influence of Plato and his allegory of cave. So God is transcendent and God is incomprehensible. You know, Bruno's best known works are the Italian dialogues he wrote while in England, including the following, all published in 1584. The Ash Wednesday Supper, on cause, principle, and unity, the expulsion of the triumphant beast, on the infinite universe and worlds. And Bruno developed a version of pantheism, combined paradoxically with Greek atomism and materialism. The universe is treated as a living being, as an infinitely extended unity containing innumerable worlds, and each of these worlds is just like a great animal with a life of its own, with inhabitants. The unity of matter is provided by universal form of the world soul, that is the influence of Neoplatonic ideas, the world soul which permeates the universe. That was a kind of pantheism which became attractive to later German idealists such as Schelling. But Bruno never identified this world soul with God. God is separate from matter and form. So Bruno combined his speculative philosophy of nature with the recommendation of new naturalistic ethics. He supported Copernicus in the Ash Wednesday Supper, and he believed that a living earth must move, and he specifically rejected any appeal to mere mathematics to prove cosmological hypotheses. You know, in later work he described the monad as a living version of the Democritean atom. This idea of monad became of really great importance to Leibniz, who developed monological metaphysics. In 15... That is artificial intelligence interfering in several lectures. Okay. These are actually the products of the technological progress. Renaissance thinkers, they envisaged this technological progress. They were the first to appreciate the value of technical inventions and how they may contribute to the arrangement of our natural environment. They cultivated this whole prospective geometrical vision of the universe. Techniques and geometry, mathematics combined with some magical symbolism were of really great importance to them. Okay, so in 1592, Bruno was arrested by the Venetian Inquisition, and 1593 he was handed over to the Roman Inquisition, which burned him to death as a heretic. Because his idea of the universe as a living and infinitely extended unity containing innumerable worlds inhabited with living creatures was absolutely incompatible with Orthodox Catholic doctrine. The idea of the multiplicity of worlds with inhabitants. The heretic idea. Now let's turn to another figure, Giovanni Pico del Mirandola. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, an Italian philosopher, one of the prominent humanists of the 15th century. Pico del Mirandola wrote a series of 900 theses which he hoped to dispute publicly in Rome, and 13 of these theses were criticized by a papal commission. And when Pico defended himself in his apology, the Pope condemned all 900 theses, and Pico fled to France, but was briefly imprisoned there in 1488. And on his release, he returned to Florence and devoted himself to private study, and he hoped to write a Concord of Plato and Aristotle, but the only part he was able to complete was on being and the one. You know, Pico del Mirandola is often described as a syncretist, synthesizer. In his work on being and the one, he uses Thomas Aquinas and Christianity to reconcile Plato's and Aristotle's views about God's being and unity. But in fact, he made it clear that the truth of Christianity has priority of the Prista Theologia, or ancient wisdom found in the Hermetic Corpus and in the Kabbalah. Pico del Mirandola was indeed interested in magic and astrology, but in his work Heptapulus, he adopts a guarded attitude towards that, and Heptapulus contains a mystical interpretation of Genesis, and in his disputations against astrology, he rejects them both. Plato's philosophy is often qualified as a celebration of man's freedom and dignity. The most famous of his works is On the Dignity of Man. On the Dignity of Man. This is a short oration intended as an introduction to the disputation of his 900 theses. In fact, the title was invented after his death. On the Dignity of Man. And Pico's view in this oration is that man is set apart from the rest of creation. He is completely free to form his own nature. Man is not determined by any pre-established design. On the other hand, in the Heptapulus, Pico saw man as a microcosm containing elements of the angelic, celestial, and elemental worlds. And man is thus firmly within the hierarchy of nature and is on a link between the worlds. In the oration, the emphasis is laid on freedom. And this emphasis is a moral one. Man is free to choose between good and evil. It is up to man to go up and to obtain the highest position, most valuable one, to become close to God, or just to degenerate into beast-like form of life. As I've told you, the ideas of Pico del Mirandola anticipated some of the insights of existentialists, specifically his thesis that existence is prior to essence. And we are what we make of ourselves, that we are not predetermined by any nature which imposes ontological constraints on our creative potential. Another very influential Renaissance thinker was Erasmus Desiderius. Erasmus was a Dutch scholar and philosopher who played an important role in Renaissance humanism, just like his Italian forerunners, Petrarch, Luigi Solitati, Lorenzo Valla, Leonardo Bruni, and others. Erasmus stressed within philosophy and theology the function of philological precision, grammatical correctness, rhetorical elegance. He tried to reform the mentality of Christians by using the means of modern philology. He called modern philology bona literaria. Bona literaria were cultivated by the study of authors of Latin and Greek antiquity. But for Erasmus, the virtues of bona literaria must be decisively linked with Christian spirituality. And Erasmus was inspired by Lorenzo Valla's Annotationes on the New Testament, annotations on the New Testament, and he completed a new Latin translation of the New Testament, edited the writings of the early church fathers, especially of the works of Saint Hieronymus, and wrote several commentaries on Psalms. So Erasmus tries to regenerate the spirit of early Christianity, and he lays bare its original sense against the background of scholastic interpretation. And according to Erasmus, the rituals of the existing church blocked the development of an authentic Christian spirituality. And though Erasmus shared with Luther a rather critical approach toward the existing church, he didn't side with the Reformation. In his work, Diatriba de Libero Arbitrio, Erasmus pleaded for the free will of man. See? And of course, another very influential trend in Renaissance thought was associated with the development of political thought. And one of the major figures which represents this new trend in political philosophy was Niccolo Machiavelli, the Italian political theorist, commonly considered the most influential political thinker of the Renaissance. He was born in Florence. He was educated in the civic humanist tradition. He was a secretary to the second Chancery of the Republic of Florence, and his duties involved numerous diplomatic missions, both in and outside Italy. So, for a certain period, he lived in enforced retirement. He was dismissed by the returning Medici regime. And he wrote a set of works, and Machiavelli's writings fall into two genetically connected categories: chancery writings, reports, memoranda, and formal books. The chief among was The Prince. So a few words about this work, because it is really influential political treatise. Machiavelli developed a new vision of politics. Politics as an autonomous activity leading to the creation of free and powerful states. And this vision derives its norms from what humans do rather than from what they ought to do. And as a result, the problem of evil arises as a central issue. The political actor reserves the right to enter into evil when necessitated. And classical, medieval, and civic humanist political philosophers required that politics must be practiced within the bounds of virtue, and this requirement is met by redefining the meaning of virtue itself. And Machiavelli put forward the idea of virtue as the ability to achieve effective truth, regardless of moral, philosophical, and theological restraints. So Machiavelli recognizes two limits on virtue: fortuna, understood as either chance or as goodness, symbolizing the alleged causal powers of the heavenly bodies, and the agent's own temperament, bodily humors, and the quality of the times. Thus, pre-modern astrological cosmology and anthropology and cyclical theory of history derived from it underlie his political philosophy. Okay, that is all for today.
Thank you.